Get ready to uncover the truth that only a few know about the most brutal warriors of Middle-earth. If you think you already understand who the Uruk-hai were, you might need to rethink your ideas. Unlike common orcs, these creatures didn't just appear by chance. They were forged with a dark purpose, molded by the ambition of a wizard who dreamed of dominating everything and everyone. Saruman didn't just want an army. He wanted living war machines, soldiers who knew no fear, pain, or hesitation. But just how were these beings created, and what was the real plan behind their existence? The answer to that question goes far beyond the films. In Tolkien's books, the Uruk-hai represent something deeper and more disturbing, a vision of what happens when war becomes an obsession and the pursuit of power knows no limits. These creatures were not just enemies. They were symbols of an army that didn't need to think, only obey. And the way they were introduced into the story reveals a plan much bigger than most fans imagine. If you've ever wondered why the Uruk-hai were so different from common orcs, or why Saruman decided to create his own army instead of simply allying with Sauron, then you're about to dive into one of Middle-earth's darkest secrets. And believe me, the truth is far more fascinating and terrifying than what we saw on screen. Now let's journey into the depths of Isengard and unravel the origins of these relentless creatures. After all, what makes the Uruk-hai so special? What lies behind their creation? And how did they forever change the course of the War of the Ring? If you know the true origin of the Uruk-hai, this race of brutal warriors that emerged in Middle-earth as an overwhelming threat, different from common orcs, they did not naturally evolve, but were the result of a dark and deliberate interference. In the heart of the Third Age, Saruman, the corrupted white wizard, set out to create something superior, something that could rival even the noblest warriors of Rohan and Gondor. He didn't want fragile soldiers who feared the light or were as disorganized as the hordes of Mordor. He wanted an unbeatable force, and he found it in the Uruk-hai. It is believed that Saruman mixed the blood of orcs with that of men to forge this new breed of warriors. Unlike traditional orcs, these weren't just puppets of terror. They possessed enormous physical strength, superhuman endurance, and a combat-minded intellect. Imagine a legion of soldiers programmed to kill without hesitation, without fear, and without fatigue. That was exactly what Saruman put into play. His influence wasn't limited to magic. He understood war, the need for dominance, and the importance of an army that wouldn't flinch at the first ray of sunlight. But why would Saruman need such a brutal army? The power game in Middle-earth demanded a force capable of challenging even Sauron. The White Wizard, who once presented himself as a guardian of peace, now dreamed of being the supreme ruler. To do so, he needed soldiers who not only obeyed, but were the very embodiment of war. He prepared his Uruk-hai as if they were living weapons, eliminating any trace of weakness that a traditional army might show. And it didn't take long for the world to see what they were capable of. Imagine being on the battlefield and seeing these creatures emerging on the horizon, larger than common orcs, with dark skin and eyes hungry for blood. Unlike Sauron's servants, who crawled beneath the cover of darkness, the Uruk-hai marched as if they were lords of war. In their onslaught against the free peoples, they feared nothing, never retreated, and their thirst for destruction was insatiable. When they began their assault, not even the most experienced warriors of Rohan were prepared for the brutality of these beings. The birth of the Uruk-hai was not an accident, but a milestone in the war for Middle-earth. With this new force under his command, Saruman believed he had found the key to conquering everything he desired. The problem: not even he fully understood the nature of these creatures, and in the end, that would cost him dearly. But before we get to that point, we need to understand how these warriors were first mentioned in Tolkien's grand work. The first time the Uruk-hai were mentioned in Tolkien's works was in The Fellowship of the Ring, when Gandalf revealed their presence while recounting the events of his escape from Moria. Until that moment, orcs were seen as mere bestial creatures, common in Sauron's army, but the Uruk-hai completely changed that perception. Gandalf described them as something different, something more dangerous. They were bigger, stronger, and showed an organization that set them apart from the typical savagery of orcs. And most shockingly, they were not afraid of sunlight. That revelation was crucial to the narrative. Before that, Middle-earth's free peoples could rely on the natural protection of daylight against orc attacks. But with the arrival of the Uruk-hai, that advantage was completely nullified. Saruman was not just building an army, he was shaping a new era of war. Whereas the free realms used to be able to anticipate enemy attacks based on the cycle of night and day, that strategy now became useless. The Uruk-hai could march relentlessly, without fear, and without giving their enemies a moment's respite. Picture the scene. The Uruk-hai appear for the first time in the books as an unyielding force, pursuing the Fellowship without hesitation. In the passage where they are described, we see that they are not just irrational brutes, but trained soldiers, coordinated and ready to follow orders without question. When they attack Boromir in an attempt to capture Merry and Pippin, there is no hesitation, no chaos, just precision. The leader of the assault, Lurtz, a character created for the films, perfectly embodies that cold-blooded brutality. Tolkien subtly introduced the Uruk-hai at first, but their presence grew exponentially as the narrative advanced. This demonstrates one of the author's brilliant traits. He didn't throw new threats into the mix by chance, but built them organically, ensuring that each element had a real impact on the story. They were not just another obstacle. The Uruk-hai appeared to change the balance of the war. They were not simply another hurdle. They were a turning point in the battle against darkness. And if their first appearance was already frightening, the difference between these new warriors and common orcs made everything even more terrifying. But after all, what made the Uruk-hai so special? What set them apart from the orcs we already knew? That's what we'll see next. If there's one thing that defines the Uruk-hai, it's the brutal difference between them and common orcs. In Tolkien's books, orcs have always been seen as ugly, treacherous, and chaotic creatures, often bickering among themselves and making mistakes simply due to a lack of discipline. The Uruk-hai, on the other hand, were a refined version of that race, warriors forged for war without the flaws that made orcs so weak and disorganized. They weren't just stronger, they were also smarter, more resilient, and above all, completely loyal to their master, Saruman. One of the greatest limitations of orcs has always been their weakness in the face of sunlight. Beings of the shadows, they became sluggish, disoriented, and even easier to defeat when exposed to the light. This meant that Sauron had to plan his attacks strategically, ensuring that his armies only marched at night. The Uruk-hai, on the other hand, broke that rule. They could march under the sun without losing their strength, making them a constant threat. Imagine an enemy that never rests, that never weakens over time, and that can strike at any moment. That was the terror Saruman unleashed upon his adversaries. The issue of discipline was also a key differentiator. While common orcs frequently quarreled, deserted, or even betrayed their commanders purely by survival instinct, the Uruk-hai followed orders without hesitation. They were soldiers, not mere servants. Saruman had created an efficient war machine, capable of marching for days without rebelling against its own ranks. If common orcs were like wild dogs, the Uruk-hai were like trained wolves, hunting with precision. Not only did they fight better, but their sense of unity made them a far more dangerous force on the battlefield. Another crucial point was their physical strength. Common orcs, though agile and fierce, had twisted bodies and often suffered from physical limitations. The Uruk-hai, on the other hand, were taller, more muscular, and possessed an impressive vigor. They not only withstood exhausting marches, but could also fight for long periods without showing signs of weakness. This was evident in the relentless pursuit of the hobbits, Merry and Pippin. They ran for days without stopping, something impossible for normal orcs. With these differences, the Uruk-hai quickly became Saruman's elite troops. But there was an even more interesting detail. Despite sharing a common origin, not all Uruk-hai were the same. There were differences between those serving in Mordor and those belonging to the army of Isengard. And this distinction ran deeper than many imagine. Not every Uruk-hai served Saruman. In fact, the origin of the Uruks dates back to Mordor, long before the White Wizard began his experiments. Sauron had already created a stronger variant of orcs, known simply as Uruks, who were tougher and more disciplined than their smaller cousins. They made up the front line of the troops of Barad-dûr and had their own symbol, Sauron's red eye. But there was a fundamental difference between Mordor's Uruks and Isengard's Uruk-hai. While the former still bore some of the typical orc weaknesses, such as a reluctance to face sunlight, the latter were designed to be supreme warriors. Saruman didn't just want strong soldiers. He wanted creatures free of the vices and limitations of common orcs. His Uruk-hai were better trained, more disciplined, and deadlier. They did not answer to Sauron, but exclusively to the White Wizard. This detail is essential as it shows how Saruman, in his arrogance, believed he could defy the Dark Lord and create his own army, while Mordor's Uruks still carried the fear and submission to Sauron. Isengard's Uruk-hai were relentless war machines, forged to obey their master's orders without question. The rivalry between the two groups was evident. In the books, we see that the smaller Mordor orcs frequently clashed with Isengard's Uruk-hai, who openly despised them. To the Uruk-hai, common orcs were weak, unworthy of respect, and useful only as cannon fodder. They even called them Snagga, which means slave in the Black speech. This internal tension among the forces of evil was a reflection of the very relationship between Saruman and Sauron. The White Wizard feigned loyalty to the Dark Lord, but deep down he harbored his own ambition to rule. And this dispute manifested directly in the soldiers they created. We can clearly see this difference in the Battle of Helm's Deep. Saruman's Uruk-hai marched in formation, organized, carrying shields and spears like a disciplined legion. They didn't need the constant supervision of a Nazgul to keep order. Meanwhile, Mordor's Uruks, though more powerful than normal orcs, were still prone to chaos and unbridled brutality. They could be effective, but they never reached the strategic level and efficiency of Isengard's warriors. This makes it clear that despite sharing the same root, Uruks and Uruk-hai were distinct categories. But the difference wasn't just in their loyalty or mentality. It also showed in their appearance and the equipment they used. While Mordor's orcs had a more chaotic and rudimentary look, the Uruk-hai sported superior armor and weaponry. And that brings us to an essential point. How were these warriors equipped, and what made them so lethal in combat? The Uruk-hai were visually distinct from common orcs, and that wasn't just an aesthetic detail. It was a direct reflection of their superiority as warriors. They were taller, more muscular, and carried themselves with an upright posture, whereas traditional orcs tended to hunch over, their bodies twisted by corruption. Their skin was generally darker, and their eyes burned with a fierce intensity, demonstrating their aggressive nature. Unlike the lesser orcs, who had rotten teeth and a scruffy appearance, the Uruk-hai looked like elite soldiers, ready for war at any moment. Their equipment was also superior. While common orcs used makeshift, rusty, and often broken weapons, the Uruk-hai wielded broad, well-forged blades designed to cut through armor and shields with brutal efficiency. Their swords had a curved, serrated design, making their blows even more destructive. In addition, they carried long war bows, unlike the small, crooked bows used by normal orcs. This gave them a tactical advantage, allowing them to attack from a distance with more precision and power, but the real game changer was their armor. Mordor's orcs wore varied and disorganized gear, often patched together with pieces of rusted iron and worn leather. In contrast, Isengard's Uruk-hai donned standardized armor, made of sturdy metal and designed to withstand heavy blows. Their helmets were iconic, with a visor that covered part of the face, leaving only the eyes exposed. On top, an angular design reinforced their intimidating look. Every piece of the Uruk-hai's armor had a clear purpose: protection without compromising. Mobility. Another striking detail was their shield. The Uruk-hai used large metal shields emblazoned with Saruman's white hand symbol. This wasn't just a matter of identity, it was a sign of dominance and absolute loyalty to their creator. Unlike Sauron's orcs, who bore the red eye on their armor, the Uruk-hai took pride in displaying their affiliation with Isengard. This distinction was not only visual, but also ideological. The Uruk-hai saw common orcs as inferior, and to them, the white hand was a symbol of superiority. With this imposing look and arsenal of war, the Uruk-hai were the ultimate shock troops, but their identity wasn't defined solely by what they wore. There was also a deep meaning in the symbols they carried. And when we talk about symbols, we need to understand what the white hand represented, as well as the difference between the emblems used by the armies of darkness. In Middle-earth, symbols were not mere adornments, they were declarations of power, loyalty, and purpose. The Uruk-hai carried Saruman's white hand on their armor, shields, and even branded on their skin, a clear sign of who their true master was. That symbol wasn't chosen at random. The white hand represented Saruman's absolute control over his creations, a reminder that he had molded these warriors with his own hands. For the Uruk-hai, bearing that emblem wasn't just an obligation, it was a badge of honor, a sign that they belonged to the elite of the Dark Armies. In contrast, Sauron's orcs bore the red eye, a symbol of vigilance and terror. Sauron's eye was a constant reminder that nothing escaped the Dark Lord's gaze, and his servants lived under that oppressive rule. The Uruk-hai, however, were not controlled by fear. They obeyed Saruman because they were created for it. Unlike Mordor's orcs, who often trembled before their master, the Uruk-hai followed orders without question, for their very blood and existence had been shaped for war. This difference in loyalty also influenced how they viewed other orcs. The Uruk-hai despised the lesser orcs, calling them snaga, which meant slave or vermin. They considered themselves superior, stronger, more disciplined. While Mordor's common orcs were known for fighting among themselves, deserting, and even betraying their own, the Uruk-hai adhered to a brutal yet effective code of conduct. For them, only the strong deserved respect. The rivalry between Sauron's followers and those of Saruman became evident when the two groups were forced to work together. For instance, when the Uruk-hai capture Merry and Pippin, there's a clear conflict between the warriors of Isengard and Mordor's orcs. The lesser orcs want to take the hobbits directly to Sauron, but the Uruk-hai make it clear that they follow different orders. This culminates in an internal fight, where the Uruk-hai kill several Mordor orcs, proving they would not accept being treated as inferior. This visual and ideological identity made the Uruk-hai a distinct force in Middle-earth. But their advantage wasn't solely in their symbolism. Their true power came from their physical endurance and combat brutality. And when it came to marching, battles, and relentless pursuits, there was no one who could match them. The Uruk-hai were not just brutal warriors, they were tireless. Unlike common orcs, who often complained of fatigue and needed to rest during long marches, the Uruk-hai could run for days without showing any signs of exhaustion. This factor completely changed the rules of war in Middle-earth. Traditional armies had to plan their movements carefully, taking into account the physical strain on their soldiers. But the Uruk-hai, they simply marched on, covering distances that left their enemies no time to react. A clear example of this superhuman endurance was the pursuit of Merry and Pippin. After capturing them, the Uruk-hai ran relentlessly across the vast plains of Middle-earth, while Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli struggled to catch up. Even the best warriors of Rohan would have had trouble keeping up with that pace. And what's even more impressive, they weren't just running, they were carrying prisoners, heavy armor, and still preparing for any combat that might arise. Along the way, this level of endurance made them the perfect shock troops to encircle and annihilate enemies before they even had a chance to respond. But it wasn't only their physical stamina that set the Uruk-hai apart. They were extremely skilled fighters, trained to fight aggressively and efficiently. Unlike common orcs, who relied more on their numbers than technique, the Uruk-hai used military formations, marched in an organized manner, and knew exactly how to wield their weapons with expertise. They didn't just attack in a wild frenzy. They knew how to break shields, press enemies against walls, and strategically surround targets. They weren't merely monsters, they were soldiers. Another important aspect was their resistance to injuries. In Tolkien's books, we see that the Uruk-hai could withstand blows that would kill an ordinary human. Their thick skin and robust bodies made them hard to take down. And even when injured, they kept fighting until their bodies could fight no longer. This trait made them formidable foes. Imagine being on a battlefield and watching your best strike be completely shrugged off by one of these monsters. The sense of helplessness was what drove many warriors to despair in their presence. This resilience, combined with discipline and brutality, made the Uruk-hai the terror of any army. But their motivation wasn't driven solely by loyalty to Saruman. There was something even darker that propelled them, an insatiable hunger that made them even more ruthless on the battlefield. The Uruk-hai didn't fight just out of obedience. They were driven by something far more primitive and terrifying, an unquenchable hunger for flesh. In molding this new breed of warriors, Saruman instilled in them an even more intense instinct for hunting and violence than that of common orcs. While Mordor's orcs often fought each other over power or revenge, the Uruk-hai had a simpler, more straightforward mentality: hunt, kill, and devour. They didn't see humans merely as enemies, but as prey. This brutality was highlighted in the books when, during the pursuit of Merry and Pippin, a group of lesser orcs begins complaining about hunger. They want to stop to eat, and the Uruk-hai's response is immediate and ruthless. "Meat is back on the menu, boys." An iconic moment in Peter Jackson's films, even if it wasn't written exactly that way by Tolkien. However, the idea that the Uruk-hai were willing to eat their own prisoners was very real. To them, there was no difference between killing an enemy and devouring them afterward. It was all part of the natural cycle of war and survival. This brutal instinct made them even more feared on the battlefield. Imagine facing an enemy who not only wants to defeat you, but who sees you as a meal. That shatters any morale for resistance. The soldiers of Rohan and Gondor weren't just fighting to defend their homes. They were fighting to avoid a fate worse than death. That savage mentality made the Uruk-hai a psychological force as terrifying as they were physically. As a strategist, Saruman knew how to exploit this trait. He didn't need to whip them into line, as Sauron did with his lesser orcs. The Uruk-hai obeyed because war was in their very nature. They didn't need to be forced to fight. For them, combat was the reason for their existence. That detail made them far deadlier than any other army under the command of the forces of darkness. But all this brutality and hunger for destruction raises an interesting question. What did Tolkien really want to convey with the creation of the Uruk-hai? Were they just fearsome villains, or was there something deeper in their design? If we look at the letters and reflections of the author himself, we find a fascinating answer. Tolkien never wrote his stories merely to entertain. Every detail of Middle-earth carried a deeper meaning, a reflection on the real world. The Uruk-hai, as fictional as they were, represented something greater than mere brutal warriors. In his letters, Tolkien described the Uruks as a metaphor for the cruelest and most relentless aspects of the world. They symbolized war without honor, destruction without purpose, the corruption of power, and the brutality of an army that doesn't question orders. To him, true evil wasn't found only in the great villains, but in those who choose to follow the path of violence without question. One of Tolkien's most interesting reflections on evil is that he rarely portrayed it as absolute. In The Lord of the Rings, we see characters who are corrupted by power, yet we also see those who have the chance to change, to redeem themselves. However, the Uruk-hai break that pattern. They were created for war, without free will, without the possibility of choice. And that raises a disturbing question. If someone is born for evil, can they be held accountable for their actions? Tolkien never answered that question directly, but his writings suggest that true evil lies in those who manipulate and exploit others for their own ends, just as Saruman did with the Uruk-hai. This idea also connects to the historical context in which Tolkien lived. He fought in World War I, where he saw firsthand the horror of trench warfare and the brutality of soldiers who were often just cogs in a larger machine. The Uruk-hai reflect that reality, warriors programmed to destroy without truly understanding the reason behind their battles. They are the personification of industrialized war, where soldiers are merely gears in a violent, ruthless system. Another interesting point is that, although the Uruk-hai are portrayed as completely evil, Tolkien never developed them as individuals. Unlike characters like Gollum, or even some orcs who display personality traits, the Uruk-hai are always seen as a collective force, almost like a faceless war machine. This reinforces the idea that true horror lies not just in the individual, but in what happens when an entire society becomes blind to morality and surrenders to brutality. This perspective makes the Uruk-hai much more than simple villains. They are a commentary on the dangers of blind obedience, the loss of humanity, and the destructive power that arises when war becomes an end in itself. And it was exactly that feeling that Peter Jackson sought to amplify when he brought these creatures to the cinema. But did his vision do justice to what Tolkien had imagined? When Peter Jackson brought the Uruk-hai to the screen, he knew he had to make them even more impressive and terrifying than in the books. And indeed, he succeeded. In the films, the Uruk-hai are portrayed as imposing warriors, larger and more muscular than common orcs, with a level of military organization that turns them into a true force of destruction. From their first appearance, emerging from the pits of Isengard, covered in mud and with eyes hungry for blood, they immediately signal that they are not just another army. They are Saruman's ultimate war machine. One of the main changes Jackson made was in the size of the Uruk-hai. In the books, Tolkien describes them as being taller than normal orcs, yet still smaller than a man. In the films, however, they are enormous, almost the size of an adult human, which enhances their menacing presence. Furthermore, their brutality was amplified to ensure that the audience felt the full weight of their threat. The scene in which Lurtz, the leader of the Uruk-hai in the first film, kills Boromir in a cruel and merciless way, is a clear example of this more violent and impactful approach. Another interesting detail is the way Jackson portrays their loyalty and mentality. In the books, the Uruk-hai are already disciplined, but in the films, this is taken to another level. They march like a well-trained army, without hesitation, without fear, without mercy. Lurtz himself, a character created exclusively for the cinematic adaptation, embodies this philosophy. He not only follows orders, but does so with a nearly sadistic pleasure, as if aware of his superiority over his foes. This characterization makes them even more terrifying, reinforcing the idea that they are not merely monsters, They are predators. The aesthetics of the Uruk-hai were also one of the adaptation's strong points. Their armor, weapons, and even the way they moved were carefully designed to convey that they were an organized and disciplined force. Their broad blades, spears, and huge shields emblazoned with Saruman's white hand create a striking visual identity. On the battlefields, they stand out among the other servants of darkness, making it clear that they are not just mere soldiers of Mordor. They are the elite of war. With these changes, Peter Jackson managed to elevate the threat of the Uruk-hai to a cinematic level that did justice to Tolkien's original concept. Yet at the same time, his portrayal in the films raises a question. Is the brutality of these creatures merely a reflection of fantasy, or is there something in them that makes us reflect on the real world? Perhaps in the end, the Uruk-hai are more than just warriors. Perhaps they are a mirror of the wars that humanity itself has waged. Now that you know the dark origins and brutality of the Uruk-hai, the big question is, what can we learn from this? If Tolkien taught us anything, it's that the real danger isn't just in the visible monsters, but in what created them. Saruman believed he could mold a perfect army, but ended up consumed by his own ambition. How many times in the real world do we see powerful figures making the same mistake, believing they can control what they create, only to be destroyed by it in the end? The Uruk-hai were not just fearsome creatures. They were the embodiment of limitless war, blind obedience, and unrestrained brutality. They were a threat not because they were strong, but because they knew no other reality than destruction. And that raises an interesting question. How many armies in human history have been created in the same way, without question, merely to serve a greater purpose? So, what did you think of this analysis of the Uruk-hai? Do you believe that Tolkien used them as a metaphor for something greater? Or do you think they were just one of many dark forces in Middle-earth? Let me know in the comments. Your perspective on this topic can enrich the discussion even further. If you enjoyed this content and want to keep exploring the mysteries of Middle-earth, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here we unravel the most fascinating secrets of Tolkien's works and show how these stories go far beyond mere fantasy. So don't miss the next videos. There's so much
more to explore.